Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Detections with your host, Understudy 77. I'm sorry, Exiled cannot be with us tonight. If you've been following our exploits and the little bit of timey-wiminess that happened, he is currently now in Mexico as we record this. He'll be long since back by the time you listen. But we've got a fill-in and a wonderful one, in my opinion, Mr. Chris Sanders, who's going to be joining us to chat this evening. Hi, Chris.
Howdy.
In any guest episode, Chris, we tend to kind of start with tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you're coming from. Basically, let everybody know who you are.
All right. Well, by day, I kind of have two jobs. One is I run a company called Applied Network Defense. We are a training company, mostly focused on online training, but we do a little bit of on-site training as well. Really focused on mostly security analysts, but really security practitioners, blue teamers, things of that sort. Also do quite a bit of applied research, kind of at the intersection of investigative work and psychology and education, and try to contribute that back to the community where we can. So that's part of my day job. The other part's an organization called the Rural Technology Fund, which is a charity I founded a little over a decade ago. We go into rural areas, work with teachers, and give them the things they need to teach kids about STEM and the computer industry and get them excited about those jobs and give them a little bit of a leg up for those who might want to pursue those jobs later on in life. All the things they kind of need to get some of those higher paying jobs, maybe get them out of generational poverty, inject some of that money back into their communities and so on. So those are how I spend most of my days. I guess in terms of the practitioner side of things, my background's mostly in SOC. I spent most of my career as an analyst in one form or another, starting out in public education, eventually moving into the government before I moved to the private sector, working there in Guardians and Mandiant for a while. Most of those roles were centered on some form of research or education, and then particularly on SOC. So both working in the SOC, then eventually running SOCs, building SOCs, and now teaching and researching SOCs. So that's me in a nutshell right now.
Awesome. So I'm not going to lie to anybody who's listening. I'm probably going to fanboy a little bit through this. I'm a huge fan of Chris. I read most of what he publishes, and then I use most of what he publishes to try to convince people about how to do things. So like, I strongly encourage you all right now, after you listen to this, to go check out his works, and plus the rural technology fun stuff, which we will talk about in a little bit. But I'm always curious, like what is it that brought you into the education thing? Have you always been an educator, or like what brought you into the research and education? Like where did that passion come from?
I really have, and I don't think I always realized that I was an educator of sorts. I think I first started doing this when we got our first computer, and it was something kind of hobbled together from parts. And I was young, and I was kind of took to it naturally. My mom didn't, and she would mess around with it and get really mad at it, and I would have to teach her how to do the things. And I would get really mad at her that I had to do it and show her so many times. But what I didn't realize was that she was teaching me how to be a teacher and have patience and all of those things. And that's been pretty valuable to me. So ever since then, as I've learned things, I've always wanted to share those. I've been blogging at this point for a really long time. Writing and blogging about packet analysis as I was learning it is the thing that got me recognized by No Starch Press, and they asked me to write a book called Practical Packet Analysis.
I was going to say, you wrote the book on that, right?
Right, and that's all because I started a blog and someone saw it and liked it. And now that's 3 editions and tens of thousands of copies later, that I'm still, working on that and teaching about it and so on. So really things like that. Every job I've ever had, I've always been, whether I've taken it upon myself or it's been a formal part of the job, I have tried to take what I've learned and teach it to other people where it's appropriate. I've always believed that if you have a room with more than one person in it, it can be a classroom, and that no matter what, I should always be teaching or learning, or maybe both. And so that's just been kind of a constant theme throughout my career. And particularly now, a lot of the work I do as it relates to psychology manifests in education. That is the practical manifestation of what I do. So it's kind of been a natural fit and just something I've always done. That's
really cool. I never thought about that. Like education is one of the practical manifestations of psychology. Like that's a really cool thought. So you mentioned, you focus a lot on SOC, and we do here too, for multiple reasons. One, that like nobody really wants to talk about SOC, right? Like SOC is not sexy, so to speak. We do have a tagline here called "Make Blue Team Sexy" in general, but also like SOC is awesome. So you've been to hundreds of SOCs. Is that fair?
Yeah, lots and lots and lots of them.
So what are some kind of broad observations from all the different SOCs that you've been at? Like what kind of broad observations do you have there?
That's a big question. I probably, like I said, I've been to tons and tons of SOCs. I don't know if I've been to more than anybody, probably not, but I would certainly say I would put the number of analysts I've had deep conversations about investigations with up against anybody, because I'm doing that basically all day, every day these days. And really, a couple of things. One, I think the industry really likes to separate out what analysts do based upon types of evidence. You're either a DFIR style host forensic person, or you are a network forensic person, or maybe you're a memory forensic person. And you can really see easily why that happened. That's where most of the jobs were, so they pulled people in that direction. But at the end of the day, those are all part of a broader investigative discipline. And that is what the SOC is. It is the hub of investigation. And I think there's value in thinking with an investigator's mindset. And I think if you approach it from that perspective, then you no longer have host-based people or network-based people or memory-based people. You just have investigators. And that's honestly what we have to do the job. It's really hard these days to do an adequate investigation of an incident that's happened without pulling in at least network and host data. Yet most of us are really highly specialized in one versus the other. And I'm no different. I started out on the network side of things because I was mostly doing IDS work. So I'm a little bit weaker on the host side. So spending time thinking about this and kind of having this paradigm shift where it's not these individual evidence types. The evidence does not dictate the role of the investigator. Instead, the investigative thought process dictates it, kind of like the scientific method dictates the process of science. We can all think like investigators, and we all should, and to some degree do think like investigators. And the evidence is part of that, but it is not all of that, if that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I have this like big, wide smile on my face as we talk about this stuff. One of the things that we say a lot is that the defensive side, especially the investigative side, it's like detectives of the 21st century, right? It's not just about the evidence type or how you look at stuff, or the evidence type or what you look at, but it's how you look at things and how you kind of approach things that gets to be so important.
Absolutely. And we like to think in InfoSec that a lot of the stuff we're doing is so unique and it's never been done before. And we certainly have some of that. But from an investigative perspective, people have been investigating things for centuries. It's been a formalized field of study since the late 1800s. And really, we have a lot to learn from a lot of those other fields. And I spent a lot of time doing that. I spent a lot of time studying how do doctors perform diagnosis, because someone comes in with symptoms and they have to explore those symptoms and get to a diagnosis and a plan of treatment. That's investigating. A lawyer or a police officer has to come in and they have some type of input or complaint and they have to figure out the timeline of events that happened. That's investigating. A scientist knows about a phenomenon and they have to ask structured questions to figure out how to explain that. That's investigating. People have been thinking about this in these ways and in structured, formalized ways that are repeatable a lot, and we can learn from that. All of the ways those people do things, we're not going to do it exactly like them, but we can learn a lot from them and how they investigate and incorporate that into what we're doing. And instead of trying to do this on our own, let's stand on the shoulders of some of these giants, formalize it a bit, and all be better for it.
So what are some interesting takeaways from those other fields? And I've read some of your works on it, but maybe some people who listen haven't. What are some interesting takeaways from the doctor, the police officer, those kinds of things that people can use to be better investigators themselves?
Well, one thing I think about a lot is this notion of mental models. And a mental model is really, it sounds fancy, but it's just a way of seeing the world. It's a way of structured or organized viewing the world. It defines our lens and how we see it. And the medical field is really good about defining mental models because that's how they use to teach. And essentially, the human body is incredibly complex. It's the most studied thing in the history of the world and the least well understood. So they break it down based upon different areas. So for instance, we have organ systems. And organ systems are essentially a man-made construct. We see these organs that kind of work together in their own little thing. So they're self-contained apparatus. So we define that is going to be an area of knowledge. Hence, we get a specialization. So someone doesn't have to know in detail how every single organ system works. They, maybe as a gastroenterologist, they just need to know how the gastrointestinal system works. And it's kind of handoffs to all these other systems and kind of those points of compatibility, so to speak. They don't have to know everything about how the brain works or everything about how the limbic system works or any of that stuff. They need to know their system and those points of handoff. And this is all because the field is too vast, first of all, for anyone to understand. And it's easier to teach when you have this mental construct. We don't really have a lot of those. in our field. We haven't taken the time to formalize and think about a lot of them. We have some. Defense in depth is a mental model, not necessarily an investigative one, but one we use when we think about defending networks in a broad sense. The OSI model is a mental model that we use to describe and talk about network communication. We don't have a ton of those in security, and we really should, because those are essentially give us two things. One, they give us a way to teach people how to do this in a more structured, repeatable way. Two, they give us a way to talk about these things kind of intellectually and within our groups. So if I'm running a SOC, I want everyone to be able to talk about things using kind of the same nomenclature, the same words, at least get everybody in the same vocabulary. Not only that, I want to be able to hire someone who worked in another SOC who already knows about that vocabulary and already understands it. We're not going to agree on every term, and really all that matters scientifically is that we're able to define a term and work from that, relatively speaking. But mental models give us a way to do that, and that's something medicine is really good at. So that's an area we can learn from.
That's a really interesting thought. And just in general, like, and I feel like we as an industry very much struggle with any kind of standardization and stuff, right? It's still very wild, wild west, so to speak.
It is. And we're really bad about, we'll talk about bias more. One of the biases we're really bad about in this industry is kind of this perfect solution fallacy, where that if we can't get to a perfect solution, it's not worth arguing about or not worth talking about. And that's really unfortunate, because there's a lot of things that don't have perfect solutions that are worth talking about. And for instance, there's a lot of debate about defining terms. If you want to start a fight on Twitter, just try to define threat hunting and watch a bunch of people chime in and tell you how wrong you are.
You have any idea how many people ask me to define threat hunting on a regular basis?
Oh yeah. I teach a class on it. And I do.
You do.
I do. And in like the third slide, I have a big slide that says, here's my definition of threat hunting. And then I have an asterisk and it says, I don't care if you disagree with this. And I elaborate, because ultimately what matters, and this is not unique to our field, a lot of fields do not agree on words. For instance, the field of psychology does not agree on the word intelligence, right? And you would think they would, because that's a pretty well-studied thing. Sure. The field of sociology doesn't agree on the meaning of the word culture. All that matters kind of scientifically and operationally is that it is defined within the context it is currently being discussed and worked from. So with that, as a individual SOC, you should absolutely define what investigation means to you, or what timeline means, or what threat hunting means. Absolutely. And that way everyone can work from that. And if they view it a little bit differently, they at least then have a baseline to adjust from. So it is important.
Another really, really important one to define: incident.
Yes, absolutely. I have to define that in my class. One of my classes, I teach investigation theory, because we have a simulator, and the whole idea is people go in and work through an investigation, and they have to decide if an incident occurred. Well, I can't expect them to do that if I don't define what an incident is, because everyone has a different definition of that. And that's okay if your SOC has one versus what someone else has one. It'd be great if we all agreed on the same one, but at least within the individual SOC, we should be able to at least state that, write it down, and then at some point the person in charge of the SOC, kind of with collective buy-in, should be able to say, this is what we're working with, let's go with it.
This is how we view the world.
Yes.
This is who we are. This is how we view the world.
This is our mental model. This is our lens.
Exactly. I like that a lot, actually. I really do. And it's really interesting to kind of make some of these parallels, and we make the parallel to the detective thing a lot, and I mentioned that. And it becomes really interesting when you start to think about it like that, because like I talk to technical people, or like even non-technical people, like when I interview, right? And I'm going to give up some interview secrets here. But like one of the first questions that I ask is in an interview is, if I stick an email in front of you and I say, what are you looking for in an email to tell me if you think it's suspicious? Like, where are you going to dig? What do you care about? And one of the things that is always really surprising to me is that technical people love technical solutions, and they don't ever really talk about human solutions. So like if an email is malicious, every time it's going to have some call to action, right? But nobody ever talks about that. They talk about links, they talk about headers, they talk about, spoofing, but they don't ever talk about like looking at the context and the call to action, and like thinking of it from the human lens either, which I think is really interesting to me, that like technical people just don't do that very often.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
But I mean, so, interacting with the analysts that you interact with, I assume that that's something that you see. Maybe it's not something, maybe it's just something that I've seen in my limited experience, but like what other kinds of things do you see along those lines that would surprise like not people like us?
Well, I think probably the biggest thing, and maybe this is kind of the crux of why I do most of what I do is even the folks who are really, really good at this, the guys or girls who we would all look and point at and say, this person really, really gets it. They often can't tell you why or how they are good at what they do. And that is, well, it's mind blowing, first of all. And it's also really, really bad. It's a sign of kind of this overall lack. Well, it's kind of this cognitive crisis in what we're doing. Whereas we all know this is important and we all want to do a good job at it, but even the folks who are good at it cannot tell us why or how they're good at it. And if that's the case, how are we going to expect them to train the next generation or train people in their own SOC? All of the knowledge they have is tacit. It's unwritten. They just have it and they don't quite understand it. And this all stems from what we call a lack of metacognitive awareness. And if there's one word, I always tell people, if there's one word you take away from interacting with me, it's this word metacognition, which is a fancy way of saying thinking about thinking. It is being aware of our own thoughts, understanding how we think about things, how we approach things, how we get from A to Z when we're doing anything. And that's anything in the world, but in our use case, it's specifically applied to investigations. How do I go from alert to no, this is a false positive, or yes, this is an incident and this is what happened? How do I do that? And I probably ask that question to more people in a day than anybody ever has in their whole career. And the answers are so wildly different. And part of that is going back to mental models. We all have different terminology and ways of seeing the world and describing what we see. Sometimes you find out people we think are really good at this, when they get to talking about it, maybe aren't so much. They're just kind of flying by the seat of their pants. There's a whole lot that goes into that, this notion of defining why we're good at what we do. So that's really the ultimate question I've sought to answer is what makes someone who is good at this good at it? Because once we know that, we can reverse engineer the whole process, right? We're going to derive tons of mental models from that. I've defined a lot of them in my writing and in my classes. We can define a process for how all of that works. Sometimes it's maybe not one process. Sometimes it's maybe a few of them. That's okay. There are 3 or 4 ways people approach threat hunting. There's generally one way folks approach an alert-based investigation. But by kind of reverse engineering these processes and using some scientific modes of inquiry, both qualitative and quantitative research, we can kind of get to the root of some of that.
You know, I remember reading the last paper that I think you published, and I remember it was that whole thought experiment, right? Thinking about what you think about. Mm-hmm. And I remember going, man, I should really start doing this, because I feel like one thing I'm really, really good at is like talking about the art of this and that intersection between like the mind and the art and the gut and the feeling. And how can I take that out of even my own process and figure this stuff out? That paper actually made me think a lot about like how I approach things to see if I could come up with a better way to do it.
That's good. And it's one of those things, once you kind of accept this notion of the importance of metacognition, it's kind of like seeing something you can't unsee. Like it changes you. It changes the way you look at everything in the world, whether it's investigations or it's social injustice or it's politics or it's relationships with people. Once you kind of get this awareness of your own thoughts, it was a life-changing thing for me, honestly. Like there came a time in my career where I got really bored with computers and was like, do I want to do this for the rest of my life? And then I discovered, well, if I thought computers were interesting, what about people? And this metacognition was kind of that gateway into that for me. And now teaching it and seeing other people kind of light up with that recognition of the power of thinking about thinking, because really metacognition has 2 components. One is knowledge of your cognition, which is understanding how you think in certain situations. And the other, which is the real important one here, is regulation of cognition. Because once you understand how you think, you can then choose how and when to apply it. So you can apply certain ways of thinking to certain situations. And that is a game changer in a number of ways. Not just where you have a singular lens through which you see the world, but you then shift that lens based upon things you pick up in a situation and do it knowingly. That is powerful, my friend.
Oh, absolutely. And that paper was just so cool. Like I was such a big fan of that. But
Thank you.
So, I mean, you know, especially as we talk about analysts, like that ability, but like, and we talked about this a little bit pre-show, but one of the things that I find really interesting about the SOC work and the SOC world and stuff, and this is definitely worth talking about, I think, and you have a better lens than most to talk about it. SOC analysts kind of get it pretty rough because quote unquote entry level, very little trust most of the time, very little ability to go do their job. But because it's quote unquote entry level, it seems like everybody around them seems to have an idea of how it should be done without actually understanding what it is that they're doing or what they're trying to accomplish, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's an unfortunate thing. And you and I were kind of talking about this a little bit off air earlier. It almost makes me just sad that a lot of people are going to work. Let me put it this way. Let me back up. Most SOCs are not doing a very good job, and that's unfortunate. So most people who will work in a SOC are not going to have a very good time, or they're going to have perceptions on what the job can be based upon an organization or a group that's failing. And if that's all you've ever known, then yeah, you're probably going to think SOC is a horrible job. And you're going to look at like people like me and like you and others who spend their career in the SOC and say, gosh, what's wrong with them?
I mean, you, much like me, I think get asked that question, right?
Yeah. And then not everyone's going to get the chance to walk into a SOC and see where it's done right and where it's done well. Or maybe they don't have the ability to walk into a SOC that's maybe not doing it well on the whole, but they're doing this one facet really well and then put together those pieces. There are not a lot of SOCs that are honestly doing it really, really well. But once you see those and see how that works, SOC is the most exciting job in the world. Everything that we love about security and investigations happens in the SOC. You have all of these weird signals and it's a puzzle and you have to put the puzzle together and you figure out what's going on. And you're the hero because you're the one to find it and you get to exercise your curiosity and you get to use all these tools and you get to dabble in this data and maybe you get to write your own tools. You get to write your own detection. You can dabble in malware analysis. You can dabble in IR. It all starts at the SOC analyst job. And when you see that done well, I can't imagine wanting to do most anything else because you get exposed to so much. And as a curious person, and most of us who come to this job have probably a little more curiosity than the average, it's a great way to be able to exercise that, which is convenient because it's also important for doing a good job. So I think SOC can be the best job in information security. It's not in most places, but part of why I do what I do is to try to kind of make that better for folks and help them see ways it can be better, I guess.
I agree, because I think it has a lot of that ability, right? I think one of the things that ends up being striking to me as a hiring person over the last many, many years is this concept of like when I interview and like, you're interviewing like a 10-year SOC vet, right? And you start asking like questions like, so how would you perform link analysis? How would you scope an incident? How would you do basic file analysis? And I'm not talking like RE. I'm talking like sandboxing and like how would you determine things so that you can then go scope and find out the full extent of your incident. And one of the things that really saddens me that I really want to see change over time is this concept that a lot of these people can't answer that question. They've never been exposed to it or they've never been allowed to. And I admit early on in my career, I quit a job because I said, I want to do file analysis. And they said, no, you're not allowed. You're not a tier 3. So I said, okay, I quit. And I went somewhere that would let me do that stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's that trust thing that is also really, really interesting of not actually letting people grow and learn and build. And it holds back from the whole job. Like the importance of the job, like if you cut down to the mission statement of it, right, is to find badness, protect people. Like the whole concept behind the SOC is the first line of defense, the people actively looking for attacker activity or insider activity or any of the, anomalous other kind of activity that you might look for. But if we don't give those people the tools or the training or the ability to do it, they'll never be effective at it. And they'll continue to be viewed as, next generation help desk.
Absolutely. And, it's curiosity is a key again here, because if you have the view, if you're in a SOC that has the view that the analyst job is to do nothing but sit and look at incoming alerts, run those alerts to ground, and then close them out, you're not going to keep your analyst for very long.
I call it paint by numbers.
Yeah, or if you are that analyst, you're probably not going to want to be in that job very long. People come to this job because they're curious, because they want to, figure out what the commonality is between all the disparate signals, or because they read the cuckoo's egg and they want to be like Cliff Stoll and find this one little weird thing that leads to this one big thing that's game changing. Or they read Sandworm recently and they said, wow, I want to be the person who's named in this book. It's like someone like Rob Lee, who was able to discover a lot of this and correlate all this activity that relates to very real world tangible things that mean things to regular people's lives. Like they want to do those things. And, if you're just painting by numbers, as you call it, well, you're not going to do that. So you have to find ways to feed the curiosity of the analyst. And this is an area of study for me as well, as curiosity. It's ultimately the X factor that makes the biggest difference between how quickly someone is going to gain experience in this field or whether they're not at all. And you do that by cognitive diversity. you give people the chance to explore other areas. And what I say is any analyst in a SOC I'm running is going to, yeah, they're going to look at alerts, but they're also going to be encouraged and honestly required to do at least one other thing and maybe another thing beyond that. And that other thing can be flexible. It can be malware reverse engineering. It can be detection engineering, building signatures. It can be threat intel. It can be IR. It doesn't even, it have to be security. It can be something maybe a little bit more on the IT side of things. But everybody has this curiosity beast inside of them. It's already there. We just have to not kill it. And
Right.
you don't kill it by feeding it, and you feed it by giving people access to these other things and giving them just enough information about those things that they can be curious about that. And that's where things are their best. And I see SOCs do this in different ways, but really it all has to relate to this cognitive diversity, exposing people to other things, making sure that they know that that is not just a recommended thing, it is required that they do some of that. But then within that, giving them a bit of a range of options to provide value where they can see fit. And a lot of organizations would say, well, we don't have the manpower to do that. And my simple response to that would be, well, maybe you're not really committed to the security operations center at that point.
You have to make it, though. That's the thing. Because one of the things that we do is this concept of like a monthly rotation, right? So we basically, or I basically tell my analysts, like, you're going to do a monthly. So you might join like an official hypothesis-based hunt for a month, or you're going to go do research and you're going to come back with like detection engineering kind of stuff, or you're going to focus on gap analysis, or you're going to focus on like, you're the tuning guy and you're going to work on like tuning and figuring out how we can make our signatures better and breaking up that work with things that ultimately better the program as a whole. But not only that, get these analysts who live in alerting all day thinking about not alerting, but thinking about security as a bigger picture and as an overall strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all goes back to curiosity. It's all there. You just can't kill it. And lots of SOCs do a really good job of killing it. And it makes me just sad for folks who don't ever get to see what that can look like because it's a magical thing.
Oh, it's a amazingly magical thing. Because that's when you get the people who are like, oh, well, this is interesting. Like, I'm just going to stick around. And you're like, no, go home. And they're like, no. It's cool. I want to do this. I want to be here right now. Like, there's cool stuff happening. Like, it's such a wonderfully magical thing. But, you know, we talk about kind of the way to bring that down. We talk about building the curiosity and encouraging it and like that kind of stuff. But like, what other kinds of things have you seen? Like, what other observations across your experience are notable or interesting?
One that recently you mentioned the paper that I wrote with Steph Rand recently on convergent and divergent thinking. Those are two words that probably don't mean a lot to people if they probably haven't heard them a lot before. In a nutshell, divergent thinking is having an input, an idea, and thinking about kind of coming up with a list of things related to it. So for instance, if I were to give you an IDS alert and say, this is the alert, and you might come up with a list of data sources you would look at to maybe investigate it, or a list of questions you would ask to investigate it. Or
that's how I write my SOPs.
Yeah. And the flip side is convergent thinking. So once you have this list, it's picking which one of those things do I want to pursue first? Which one has the most bang for the buck or most immediate value? And those things work together. You don't really have convergent thinking without divergent thinking. And this is something analysts do without realizing they're doing it a lot of the time. Particularly, so what we did was we did this study where we kind of did this qualitative research where we interviewed a lot of analysts, asked some very specific questions, did some surveys as well from the quantitative side, basically trying to elicit when these things got used, when people use convergent and divergent thinking. Now knowing that having seen it in the field, wanting to figure out how the relationship between that a little bit more. And what we find out is that that's generally not the default for most people. But that is something they generally move to when the stakes are a little bit higher. So we define what we call a high stakes situation. And there's a couple of factors of that. One is, whether there's a social aspect. So maybe you have to present your findings to someone else. One is maybe you're in a time crunch, something like that. So there are a number of different high stakes situations. But when people get forced into a high stakes situations, they slow down a little bit. They have an input and they list lots of different options or ways to pursue it. And then from there, they usually pick one and then go after it, run it to ground. Maybe that leads somewhere, maybe it doesn't. Then they maybe go back to the list and go to the next thing. So this notion of making this list and then prioritizing it, which sounds really, really simple, but we don't necessarily even know we're doing it. But we are in these high-stakes situations. What we learned from that is, well, if we're doing it in high-stakes situations, that means we place more importance on it. And what we also found was generally when people were going through this process, they were doing a better job. Because when you make a list, and this is an interesting thing, most people, if I told them to make a list and they would make a list of the questions they would ask or the data they would look at. They might list 15 things on it. And then I would have them pick what's the best thing. Most of the time, almost every single time, the best question, the one they wanted to pursue, was not the first one that they listed in their list. Not only was it not the first one, it was usually well on down. Like it was number like 8 or 9 or 12 or 14.
They've had more time to think.
Exactly. They've basically gone away from this kind of system one, immediate gut check, first thought type thing to more deliberate thinking. This is especially important for new folks because new folks, their gut instinct is going to be wrong most of the time, honestly. But even with experienced folks, they're going to be wrong a fair bit. We saw that in this experiment. Even experienced folks are often wrong with their first gut instinct thing. When you slow down and think about things deliberately, going back to metacognition, you are going to be doing the right thing more often than not. So if we know this is valuable, well, then we can use it, right? We can teach it, and that's what we're doing with it, right? We build some structure around this, build a mental model out of this. We drew a pretty picture to explain how it works and give it to the people, and now they can do things with it and use that to influence the process by which they do this, and even built an activity out of it. And I do this when I teach the live version of my investigation theory class, where I go in and say, here's an alert. I want you to break into groups and really quickly, in 5 minutes, list all the questions you can think about how you might investigate this. And then after that 5 minutes is up, I say, okay, now you have a minute. Go in and tell me what is the best question. And then we start talking about and contrast and compare, look at some nuances of those lists and how they are created, and I'll critique the questions and so on and so forth. And that's a way to, at that point, deliberately practice the investigative craft without actually doing it live fire, so to speak.
Sure. And before we go on, I want to roll back because we were talking about kind of like crushing dreams, right? And there's something I've told a lot of my mentees that actually might be good for people who listen to this to hear. In any situation in a technical job, if you are not getting what you need to learn on the job, or you are not allowed to do what you want on the job, you still, and I just want people to remember this, you have access to tools and technology that can still teach you a lot. You talk about like the MSSP space, and the MSSP space can often be really, really bad, especially for SOC analysts. But like when you have access to all 9 major SIM platforms and 200 clients and like everything that exists, if just find a little bit of time and go play, go dig. Like you have options in a bad situation to learn things and move your skill set forward and feed your curiosity. I'm not suggesting that you stay at the bad place, but you can level yourself up even in a bad situation and get somewhere that will feed your curiosity.
And I would say too, I would try to, and a lot of those MSSP environments, you're right, that's what they have. They have like 5 or 9 or 10 or whatever different SIMs or log aggregators they have to deal with. Maybe looking at Splunk on one screen and Elk on another and ArcSight on another. And that's very, very daunting when you look at it kind of as these individual silos. Mm-hmm. One of the things I really encourage is to not think about this in a tools first manner. When you have an alert, when you have an input to an investigation, that is simply a question. It is a question that you are going to ask to pursue it. There are different strategies about how to come up with that question. I've talked about convergent and divergent thinking. I also teach a model called diagnostic inquiry, which we can talk about if you like. But the general idea is you're going to have to ask a question. All of those SIMs are basically just technology that allows you to answer that question. Now, the nuance of what search syntax you're going to type in Splunk versus Elk is going to be subtly different, and there's a little bit of a learning curve there. But once you know how to ask the right question, that is key. That is the single most important skill an analyst will ever have, is the ability to ask the right question. My analysis mantra is that a question well stated is a problem half solved. If you ask the question right and you get the right question, then whatever tool you're going to use to answer it, that is a very small amount of minutia that is standing between you and your answer.
It's really funny that you talk about the asking the right question, because my whole approach to like operating procedures and things, because I don't do the click, I don't do tool-based stuff. I just don't agree with it. They're question-based. If you have a network alert, what questions do you need to ask about that thing? If you have an endpoint-based alert, what questions do you need to ask to get an understanding of that picture? And that's basically how I write my documentation, is question-based.
Yeah, and that's what I teach. When I teach investigative classes, and a lot of this is published on the blog too, it is all centered around asking the right questions and learning how to do that. Now, to do that, you have to learn, again, the concept of metacognition and how that works. You have to understand evidence, because Your evidence basically defines the realm of possibility for your questions. A question usually isn't worth asking if it is not answerable. So you have to know what you can answer given the scope of the evidence that you have available. So you learn about evidence with that in mind. But it all goes back to those questions, this process of diagnostic inquiry, wherein you're trying to diagnose some type of problem, a symptom, which is usually like an alert, and you use inquiry to do that. That is the basis for all investigations, regardless of what tools, regardless of what evidence you have.
So, as an analyst, listen up. Understanding your log sources and what's contained within them is incredibly important because it will help you know what questions to ask. Like, Absolutely. It's incredibly important to know what data you have access to know what questions to ask to get to an answer. Incredibly important.
There's a saying in medical school you learn pretty early on. It's if you hear hoofbeats, look for horses, not zebras. And basically what they're trying to tell you is don't assume it's this. If you have all these inputs, go with what is most likely. Don't go with all these other weird things.
Occam's razor.
Yeah, but what they're also saying is, you have to consider the context of that. And that's where evidence comes in. I'm sitting in Georgia right now. And if I hear hoofbeats, I'm probably going to assume horses. If I'm sitting in, I don't know, Kenya, I might assume zebras. Right? That's it's contextual awareness. The evidence that I have to work with based upon where I'm at in the United States is, horses are more likely. In other parts of the world, that may be different. They probably don't learn horses, not zebras, in medical school in some of those other places in the world. Yeah. And that's because you have to allow the evidence available to define the realm of possibility. That's all evidence does. Evidence answers questions. If your evidence cannot answer a question, well, then you probably need to ask a different question.
Very, very fair. Before we pivot into the rural tech fund stuff, what piece of advice or what massive piece of advice or thing do you have for like SOC analysts out there? Maybe and especially for the ones who are feeling a little downtrodden or, like they're not being encouraged to explore their curiosity. Like, what would you tell them? What advice do you have?
Well, I think the first thing is there are places where this is done and it is done well. We are in a really great time to be a practitioner in this field in that there are lots of jobs available. The first one is the hardest to get. Once you have that first job, a little bit of experience, you can move around kind of as your personal situation allows you to do. So there are other opportunities. Just because your one SOC job right now is bad and it's got you down and you're not getting to do the things you want, well, don't let that define the whole industry, the whole role for you. That's probably a big thing. There was a time in my life where I would tell folks, hey, you can do this on your own time too. And I would still say you certainly can. If you're really interested in this, you can do it on your own time. I'm a little more hesitant to do that these days because it's really easy to burn out and it's really easy to kind of get lost in the slog of that and kind of be pushed away from the industry for other reasons.
The expectation that we have of an industry that people eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff is a little unrealistic oftentimes, I think. And I think we're very hard on people because of that. Like they look at this and they go, oh, you mean like I'm not allowed to see my kids anymore? Or I'm not allowed to do this? Like, I don't want any part of that.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I've had a lot of like aha revelation moments as I've been kind of studying psychology and bringing that into tech. One of the earliest ones I had was this notion, everyone has this notion of there's your work self and there's your personal self. And they're these two separate things that are maybe only kind of related. And the truth is they're all the same self completely. And any silo you put up between them is to some degree artificial.
Yeah, people are complicated. They're allowed to have multiple facets.
Yeah.
It's still you.
And so you have to keep that in mind. Just because you think the work isn't affecting the home or the home isn't affecting the work, that's just not the case. It is, even if it's being kind of repressed at any given moment. So you have to take care of yourself. If you're young and in this career, if you're 22 years old and you're in your first SOC job, you've been in a couple of years and you hate it, you've got a long career ahead of you. And the good thing is education is more ubiquitous than it's ever been. Opportunities to experiment with things in terms of CTFs, defensive CTFs, things like boss of the SOC.
Shout out to OpenSock too, which is
Yeah,
really awesome.
OpenSock. There's a lot of great opportunities for things like that to get exposure to these other things. And honestly, it doesn't take a lot of it. If you have a little bit of a SOC background, if you get a little bit of exposure to some of these other areas, it becomes incredibly easy to move into roles doing those things. And I'll also tell you this. We were talking about this a little bit of this off air. I look at SOCs now, and the SOC hasn't been a concept that's been around for that long. I look at it now as we are kind of in the second generation of SOC. The first generation of people were the folks who built the first SOCs, and they did the best, kind of did the best they could. They kind of flew by the seat of their pants, and we have what we have. The second generation of SOC, which is really where we're at right now, are folks like me and you, who were maybe working in those SOCs at some point, but weren't really running them or didn't build them from scratch ourselves. So now we're running those SOCs or defining how those SOCs are run. And we're really looking back at what a lot of those people did and trying to fix it, so to speak, make it better. We're really the first generation that is actually thinking about these things like metacognition and mental models and making tacit knowledge explicit. Our time will end. SOC is going to get there. It's going to get there, and it's going to be really awesome. And right now I say most SOCs are horrible. There will be a time when most SOCs are good. I do believe we'll get there. I don't think it's going to be in this generation. I think that's more of a third generation. I think that is the next generation. So if you're really young in your career, you're going to be around for that. You're going to be part of that. Chances are you're probably going to be running that. You're going to be able to do this how you want to do it. And you're going to be able to do it, hopefully, based on a lot of the stuff we're doing.
Hopefully also fixing all of our mistakes.
Exactly. A lot of the reason I'm doing what I'm doing and the way I'm doing it is knowing that I'm doing a lot of this research that I'm never going to be able to fully act on or see manifested other than the education that's associated with it, in hopes that when this kind of third wave of SOC comes around, that people will be able to take this, build on it, and make magic with it. I'm hesitant to use this notion of like waves or generations because I don't want to sound like a sales guy. We're talking about next gen AV or something like that. I don't mean
next
that.
Next gen blue team.
But really, it's all about generations of employees in this space, people working in this profession. So if you're young in your career, don't get discouraged because eventually I think, take notes, find out what you like and what's working and what's not, learn from the people that you think are kind of on the forefront of this. And eventually this is going to be your world. So you'll be able to define it how you want. And that's pretty cool.
That is super, super cool. Any advice for analysts to be better analysts?
I mean, thinking about thinking, right? Stop and pause. And, we're really encouraged to go fast in what we're doing. And we want to go fast. We want to be expedient because a lot of our jobs are overhead in an organization. We have a lot to do in general, things like that. I get that. Take some time and slow down. When you get an alert and you're investigating, stop. Make a list. How would I investigate it? What are all the ways I would investigate this? Write it down. Take a minute, look at that list. Okay, I have all these options. Which one is the best to pursue? Why? Better yet, do this as a group. If you're in an organization where you're sitting next to another analyst or you have a small group, do this, write it down, everyone do it, share your stuff together, talk about it. Learn why other people come at something. Don't focus so much on what the best answer is or the right answer is immediately. Just understand how people think. Get your mind thinking in this metacognitively aware way. There will come a time where then you get to the point where you can start maybe judging what is the best way of all these things you're listing out. But just start thinking that way. It's kind of like a muscle. And the more you think kind of in this metacognitively aware way, the more it's going to get stronger, and the more it's going to allow you this ability to shift lenses all over the place. You can do that in other things that aren't investigation related, but the daily investigations of the SOC are a great way to do that. So I would recommend doing that. Honestly, take a few minutes every day and do it. Take a couple days a week and a few minutes out of those days and do it. It doesn't take a large time investment to start thinking this way and becoming more metacognitively aware.
I actually really, really like that it's human advice, and it's like, typically when people get asked for advice, like what to do, how to get to the next step, things like that, it's very technical. It's do this CTF or read this book or understand this concept. I really, really like that this is like a very approachable, like human kind of thing about how you can apply this in way more aspects of your life. And I just think that's a really cool take.
Well, it's all humans, right? That's the thing that's at the center of every investigation. Despite what any vendor tells you, you cannot automate the investigative process. You can automate the retrieval of data and helping us do things that allow us to make decisions, but ultimately humans are going to be making decisions. That's not going to change in our lifetimes.
Oh, not at all.
Or the next set of lifetimes, honestly. So with that in mind, I mean, if the human's always at the center, then why aren't we spending more time thinking about the human? Why aren't we optimizing the human more? I mean, we want our tools to be optimized, and that's all great and good. But honestly, those challenges are a lot easier. And honestly, many of them, not all of them, but many of them have been solved in one way or another if you put the right pieces of the puzzle together. The human part hasn't yet. And this is a great gateway into that. I don't think any of that happens without more. This is more of a notion of metacognitive awareness.
Well, I think I would agree with that. And I'm going to throw you a curveball because this is a really interesting one. And I'm just very interested to get your take on this.
Okay.
For aspiring SOC analysts or aspiring blue teamers, people who want to break in, how do you do it? Is it education? Is it CTFs? Is it like, how do you get, you talked about like that first job is hard, right? How do you make yourself desirable in that first job?
That's a good question. You know, I would like to say, you know, everyone interviews people differently. You interview SOC analysts, I do it, everyone does it. There's this notion of the way it should be done that honestly not a lot of people are doing. Then there's the way it is done. The way you're probably going to show the biggest amount of expertise if you want to be a SOC analyst is through evidentiary knowledge. It is generally by understanding what Windows event logs can offer you and having, you know, what are the best ones? Why is Windows Event ID 4688 useful to you? Why do you want to prove program execution? Those sorts of things. Why is PCAP useful? Because most of the questions you're going to get asked in an interview are going to be centered around those things. I don't think that's the way to do it, but that's the way a lot of people do it.
I was going to say, unless I interview you, which I ask almost none of those questions.
Yeah, I don't either. Like I'll ask a couple because that's an important factor of it, but not.
Sure.
It's not the only factor. But that's, I have to weigh what I would do versus what's realistic.
What's normal. Right?
So
I tell anybody I mock interview, like I am not the gold standard for interview. I probably interview very differently than most people. So
yeah,
be prepared for that.
And so the thing I would recommend to you is read a lot of incident reports. We're at a time now where lots of incident reports are public. They get published, whether it's something really detailed like the Equifax hack, the congressional testimony, or some of the shorter stuff like the malware reports that like a CrowdStrike or a FireEye or something like that might publish. Start reading those. When you're reading it, there's going to be things you don't understand. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself, why did this thing happen? Go look it up. The information is out there. The problem with ubiquity of information is there's a lot of crappy information out there, but along the way, you're going to start learning what good information sources look like and what don't. You have to go through these things, read a lot of them, start asking yourself questions as to regards to why these things are happening or what this looks like. Eventually, that'll maybe lead you to set up a lab and experiment with some of these things yourself. That's all good. That's probably one of the quickest ways to get immediate knowledge that is specifically applicable to getting through that interview to your first blue team job.
And I tell everyone that labs and personal projects and things like that are absolutely applicable on an InfoSec resume.
Yeah.
100% put that kind of stuff on your resume.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's experience, right? It doesn't have to be corporate to be experience.
It doesn't. We've talked about a lot of things today that I think are things that analysts have to focus on and be good at, but that is a different question than what you need to be good at to get the job in the first place and to ace that interview. Because most, like I said, and I'll be honest, most interviews suck. They're asking dumb questions that don't matter. Someone's asking you what port FTP runs on, and they try to trick you when you don't say the other one that sometimes things happen on, and that's stupid because we can look all those things up, and that's just, it frustrates me.
You're just one of my favorite people right now, man.
But that you have to play the game because it is getting the first job is a game. Once you get the first job, it gets tremendously easier to get the second and the third job once you get some of that on your resume. But that first one's always the hardest.
Especially if you take that stuff that's on your resume and understand it. So yeah. I'll be completely honest. One of the things that I look for, especially from an experienced candidate, is somebody who looks past the alert. I really want somebody who looks past the alert and understands what's actually going on, how they're thinking through a problem. I'm not worried about the technology or that the alert told you something. I want you to understand what that means. Yeah. Ask the why.
Yeah, I think that's great.
So let's pivot into Rural Tech Fund because I really do want to talk about that. So do you want a brief overview what that is, what it does, a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I started the Rural Tech Fund, I guess it's been about 12 years ago now. It started out really simple. I came from a very rural area. I grew up in pretty extreme poverty. I never had to worry about where my food was coming from, but Christmas was pretty much non-existent some years. So a lot of people had it a lot worse, but we didn't have it that good either. Now, I was interested in technology at a young age. There really wasn't a lot for me. Everything I learned, I had to do it on my own. And if it wasn't for honestly a few passionate teachers who cared about me, no telling what would have happened. I'd probably still be, back in Mayfield, Kentucky, working a factory job or something like that. Who knows?
A
But
good majority of the people that I graduated with are still in town working factory jobs.
yeah, absolutely. And so it worked out for me, but I was very lucky. Honestly, I was very, very lucky. So what I knew kind of at a very early age when I was uh, graduating, after I graduated high school, was I was like, okay, I'm going to be working in this field and I'm going to have some resources, because this is a job field that pays pretty well. And really, one of my guiding life principles is this: it is that my life will, in the end, be a verdict on my recognition of the extraordinary obligations which accompany my extraordinary resources. And it would be very easy. My resources by some standards are not extraordinary. But the fact of the matter is that if you make over $33,000 a year, you're among the top 1% of earners in the world. If you have a college degree of any sort, you are among the top 5% of educated people in the world. So if not you, then who? And I take that personally. If not me, then who? So what I know tech, I know rural areas. So, and I understand the power of these jobs, what they mean to people, and how someone can come in, and when your family, your average family income is $14,000 a year, and you get a job paying $90,000 a year straight out of college or something like that, that is ending generational poverty, right? Because chances are that means your kids are then not going to live in poverty, and their kids are not going to live in poverty. Better yet, it means you might move back to that area, spend all that money in this rural area where you're making much higher than the norm, and then it lifts everybody up because money spent in that area improves the economy in a number of measurable and immeasurable ways. So I know all these things were connected. So I said, well, how do I do something about this? And it started out very simply. I just said I was going to give a scholarship to someone from a rural area pursuing a degree in some type of computer-related field. And that's what we were going to do. And that's what we did for the first couple of years. Eventually, as kind of resources increased and I wanted to do more, I started realizing, teachers are starting to understand in these public schools the value of these tech jobs in the same way that I understand it. And a lot of them have a lot of cool ideas for things they want to do that would get kids interested in technology and kind of help nurture those kids who are already interested. So we started looking for and partnering with those teachers. And that's really kind of the ethos of what we do now is we go into rural areas and we find teachers who get it. They get the value of STEM jobs, particularly computer-related jobs. And we basically work with them. Sometimes they know exactly what we want and we just give it to them and get out of the way. Sometimes they kind of know, like, I want to teach my kids robotics and computer programming, but I don't really know how. So we talk to a lot of teachers who are now doing this. So here's what we know works. So what about this? Let's talk about this thing. And we'll come up with a plan that's going to work. And we give them those things and we connect them with some of those other teachers who are already doing it. And we let the magic happen. I mean, the key to these things, we don't just send out equipment to schools where we don't have these teachers that we can work with, because then it just ends up in a closet. We work with teachers who are passionate and care and who get it. And teachers are amazing. And we let them do the cool work and we just give them the things we need to get kids interested in technology.
That's so cool. And so there's a couple things that I learned very recently, because a couple of weeks ago I had my opportunity to teach at my first high school, just kind of as a guest teacher, right, for an hour or so. And I got to go into a group of students, and I live in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is not impoverished at all. Northern Virginia is one of the richest areas in the United States. However, what I found out going through this situation when I was talking to the teacher afterward is a lot of those kids didn't feel like they had college prospects. And that surprised me for the area that I'm in. But a lot of those kids are looking at technology and very interested and would like that to be nurtured. And to battle a bias that I think a lot of people have against high school kids, because, we were all high school kids once.
Sure.
If you give most of them the opportunity and the tools to learn, they are very curious and passionate people. They want to learn things. Not everyone, but a good majority of them are very interested in having the option to learn, especially ones who have never really had that option before. So I think the stuff you're doing with Rural Tech Fund is just one of the coolest and most amazing things.
Well, thank you so much. And a lot of it's about expectations too. And this is kind of one of those core things you learn pretty quickly when you kind of get into educational theory. And it's a shame we don't really take advantage of this in public schools as much as we should. But generally speaking, young people rise to what expectations you set for them. And in public schools, often not all public schools, not all classrooms, but a lot of times those expectations get set kind of more for the lowest common denominator than the highest. And what that ends up with virtually no or low expectations, well, people are going to meet those and they're not going to have a lot of success. So not only are we getting to a point, what we're trying to do is not just give teachers this technology and have them say, well, what happens, what happens. We're having them set an expectation. We're going to give them a Vex robotics kit, and we're going to say, not only are you going to learn how to code this, but you're going to make it do this thing. You're going to build this robotic arm. You're going to build this robot that moves over here. And maybe even you're going to go to one of these Vex competitions and you're going to compete. And maybe you're not just going to compete, but you're going to do well. Having expectations really matters. That's kind of core of all learning. When you set expectations high, children generally can meet them, and generally will meet them when they're given the right resources and with the right people to help them along. And we've seen that. We funded a robotics club in Tornado, West Virginia, really small, rural, impoverished town. They didn't have a lot to work with. They had a passionate teacher. They got going on some stuff, set really high expectations. And that team is now ranked, they're one of the best teams in the state of Virginia in robotics competition. And I think they're ranked like 200th in the world out of tens of thousands of teams.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's one of the hardest things for students, right? Because if the expectation is, oh, nobody here goes to college and you're never going to amount to anything, like that's what they learn. And that's not a good thing to learn.
It isn't, and it gets carried throughout life. And we can't always count on kids to set their own expectations that high, because it's just not going to happen, particularly depending on the family scenarios they come from. If their parents don't set high expectations for them, are they going to do it themselves? Some do, but not all.
Many won't.
And we also have to consider, it's not just about getting them, a lot of folks look at what I'm doing like, oh, it's really cool. Your job is to get kids into college degree programs focused on computer education. And I'll say, well, that's part of it. Like, we really want that. College isn't for everybody, but we think, given all things being equal, it is a good situation for most of these kids that we're working with. But the problem is when you have a rural kid who gets exposed to technology and they go to college, and they end up going to college in a bigger city. So maybe someone from Mayfield, Kentucky ends up going to the University of Louisville or Vanderbilt in Nashville, so, a bigger city. Mm-hmm. Well, they're going to be in a computer science program or a telecommunications program with a bunch of kids from that city who've been exposed to this since they were in kindergarten. And maybe their parent worked in the industry, or who knows, but those kids are going to have a leg up. And what a lot of people don't think about is a reasonable number of rural kids will start a computer science program in college, but then they will quickly realize that they are dramatically outmatched by their peers, and they will drop out or change majors.
I will never forget my first couple months of college thinking I knew something about computers and realizing that I didn't, and that the people around me had a lot more ability, like prep programs and all different kinds of stuff. Like, I will never forget that feeling, that defeatism kind of thing that takes place when you go, wow, I really had no access to this.
Oh, yeah. And it's one of those things where you cannot expect most kids in that situation to just want to stick with it. Like, that's a ton of fortitude that is, not easy to learn or possess. So what most of those kids are doing, they're going to switch to something completely different. They're going to switch to maybe business administration or who knows what else. And we lose them. And that was maybe a great mind that was really interested in this stuff. And they're going to go on to do cool things, but we miss that opportunity, and they end up in a career that maybe they don't get as much out of, or certainly maybe doesn't pay as much or isn't as lucrative for them, and it doesn't really end in the way we want it to. So that's part of the battle too, is not just getting them, they have this interest. We want to get more kids interested, certainly, but for the kids who are already interested, we want to give them the things they need to have continued success in life.
That's really fantastic. And being a nonprofit, how can people help out?
The easiest way is donating, honestly. Ruraltechfund.org is the website. We're nonprofit, so it's tax deductible. You can do a one-time donation. There's recurring donation through something like Patreon. That's the biggest way, because really what we're set up to do is, I have a list hundreds of miles long of classrooms that we could work with right now. We are solely limited by funding. The more money we bring in, the more stuff we buy to work with these classrooms. So the more that we're only limited by budget in that regard, we've got a pretty efficient operation. It's mostly me, and I have a couple of volunteers who help with a few things, but we don't pay salaries. My for-profit company, Applied Network Defense, covers all the overhead. So 100% of everything that gets donated goes straight to the classroom, all of it. I'm really proud of that fact. So that's probably the easiest way to help.
That is really cool. And speaking of, with the Applied Network Defense and the training stuff that you do, because you've come here and talked with us for the evening, talked with me for the evening, I guess. I really want to give you an opportunity to kind of lay out your training, talk about the training a little bit. You did a little bit, but like personal shout out time? Like, go ahead and pimp yourself a little bit.
Yeah, so my for-profit company, the thing that puts foot on the table and also funds the Rural Tech Fund to some degree, is called Applied Network Defense, and it's basically training by practitioners for practitioners designed to be reasonably affordable. So we have several classes. We have about 10 different classes right now. Most of them are mine, but we have some that were taught by third-party authors as well. I have a class called Investigation Theory, which we talked about in a lot of ways, a class called Practical Threat Hunting, which goes into that. I teach a class on effective information security writing, which is a skill we all need and most of us lack. I lacked at one point too. We have some classes on Suricata, on Bro, which is now called Zeek, OS Query, some of the tool-based stuff. But the general idea is just to like build classes that like get to the point that have a really good balance of not just of theory and the tool, how they work together. Really, anytime we build a class, I don't just want you to learn things and get experience from the class. I want you to leave the class with the tools you need to acquire more experience rapidly. So that's we build courses with that in mind. We take some unique approaches. They're all online, all on demand. We build some custom lab tools. We do a lot of really neat stuff. And we price it all to be pretty affordably. The most expensive class we have is $800. Most of them are in the $500 to $600 range. Some of them, like my writing class, is actually only $97. It's designed to be something that anybody can get into and pretty cheaply. The idea being that folks can afford these classes if their company is not paying for them, or if the company is paying for them, they can afford to send the whole team to them. That's generally the idea. So mostly online. I do teach a couple classes on site, namely investigation theory is the big one. I teach a little bit of pack analysis too, since that's something I've done for a while, but primarily investigation theory. So that's all at networkdefense.co, and those are all there waiting for you.
And we will link all this stuff in the description, Rural Tech Fund, in this. And I was lucky enough to get to take investigation theory, at least a part of it, a couple of years back, and it was a really, really good course. I genuinely enjoyed it a lot. And I want to use it more for my current team.
That's a fun class. And I tell you, we talked about this notion of metacognition, and I just have so many people. It's the coolest thing. Once people have taken it and they walk away from it for a little bit and they get to actually employ and use some of these things, they come back to me and they're just like, wow, like, I see the world in a completely different way right now, and it actually goes well beyond what I do with investigating things. And I just think that's the coolest thing, because we live in a world where it's just really hard to shift the way people think about things in general, and to see that shift happen in people and for it to be such a positive thing for them. It's a monumental thing, and I'm pretty proud of the work I've been able to do there.
Oh, it's got to be so cool. So I also understand that, I mean, we kind of brief the topic of like, we talk about detections and we end every show with a detection. And you brought one, and I don't know what it is yet. Usually like pre-show, we figure out what this is, but like, I don't know what this is. So this is going to be really fun because I have no idea what he's going to say for a detection right now.
Okay.
But go ahead. Take it away.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this hasn't been covered already, but I've been thinking about BITS, the Microsoft Background Intelligent Transfer Service. Have y'all talked about that one on the show yet?
We have not.
Perfect. Okay. So quick rundown of BITS, if you're not, for the folks listening, maybe not familiar with it. If you run a Windows machine, you're running BITS. It is called the Background Intelligent Transfer Service because it sits in the background and intelligently transfers things. That's a really good description, I know. But basically, it's a service that's used to do things like Windows Update. And, one of the cool things about Windows Update is that, it'll download updates in the background when you're not otherwise using bandwidth. So it's not going to steal your bandwidth. It's going to do it kind of during those idle periods and things like that. It's actually designed to be kind of stealthy. Like, it's designed to transfer data in a stealthy manner. Now, when you think about that, that sounds pretty appealing to the bad guys too, particularly since it's, whitelisted in the firewalls and things. So a lot of evil things can be done with BITS, particularly with the bitsadmin.exe tool, which is used to initiate it. You can use transfer files. Like, you can use it on your machine right now to send a file to another machine out on the internet or within your network and so on. So attackers love to live off the land. They love to use tools that are already there, particularly ones that are firewall friendly. And bitsadmin is one of those. So there are lots of documented cases of attackers using that to transfer files within the network. Maybe they downloaded something malicious from the internet and they want to transfer it to a lot of other machines kind of without you noticing. They'll move laterally. So that's a good thing to look at. It's generally going to be found in a couple of places. One is proxy data. It is clear text HTTP. It has its own user agent that can be manipulated, but if you use bitsadmin out of the box, it's going to tell you that it's bits, so you can filter based upon the user agent field. You also get that URL in Windows Event ID 59. It's going to give you, it doesn't give you a lot of information, but it does give you that URL where the data is being sent to, so the destination. So a couple things you can look for there. Most of the stuff that's going internal to external is probably going to be pretty predictable, right? If you filter out Microsoft.com or a lot of different Microsoft associated things, maybe do an aggregation, filter out the most frequent things, sort by least frequently occurring thing, maybe you'll find something interesting in that proxy data. If you're looking for lateral movement, you might not get it in the proxy because that's going to be stuff leaving the network. So event ID 59 is what you're going to want to look at. Looking for UNC paths is kind of neat. So just searching for like // and then different permutations of hosts on your network. That can be pretty interesting, or just doing the broader thing and taking a network segment and aggregating based upon that field and searching for least frequent occurrence. So it is not an ultra common thing, but it is something that is done. I think I read something like last week where a threat actor was using it for something. So bits data, something worth looking at.
And that is a really cool one. I never even would have thought of that. That's super cool. Thank you. And in general, any closing statements? Any closing thoughts? I
don't think so. I just, thank y'all for having me on. It's always fun to talk about this stuff. This is what I do for a living, and the research and the educational manifestation of it. And it's really cool to talk to folks who get it. And if you're into this stuff, like I said, I spend most of my time talking to analysts about things. So if you're an analyst and you're interested in talking about how you think, let me know. Might involve you in a research project. Got several of those scheduled and coming up that will result in papers and published stuff. And always glad to talk about that sort of thing.
I would happily be involved in a research project.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm perfectly fine with being a test person.
And I'll go so far as to say one of the things that's hard to find, when I say that most SOCs are bad SOCs, a lot of what I want to do is study the good SOCs and good analysts and how they're doing it and how they're doing it well. So if you particularly think you're a really good analyst, or you work in a SOC where you're staffed with a lot of really good analysts, let me know. Like that's a hard thing to find. I can count maybe on one hand or two hands the number of like top tier, really doing it right SOCs that I know of. So that's a data shortage for me. And if you think that's you or your SOC, like let me know, and we can work something out.
That's awesome. And Chris, thank you so much for coming on. This was great. I got to fanboy a little bit. It was awesome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And for everybody out there, I'm going to change it up a little bit tonight. Go forth and think about finding badness.